everyone for coming, and I think it's great to see people here. I'm sure lots of you are here for the same reason that I really wanted to do a meeting on Angela Davis, which is that she's such a hugely inspirational figure to many of us. I know that when I was as a young mixed-race woman, to learn that you could be black, a woman, a Marxist and an activist, I think was a really inspiring thing when I started to read some of her work. And I wanted to start actually not just with Angela Davis, but with what we could think of today as the anti-Angela Davis, because actually Donald Trump stands for everything that is against what Angela Davis stands for. The racism, the misogyny, the bigotry, all the rest of it. And I think if you want any single reminder of why Angela Davis's activism and writing are still so relevant to us today, it is Donald Trump, both in person but also in terms of the things that he's been doing over the past few weeks. Angela Davis has been an activist against prisons all of her life, all of her adult life, and obviously the sight of children being imprisoned in migrant camps, I think, just says it all about what is wrong with the world in which we live. And I can't cover everything about Angela Davis in this meeting, and I hope lots of you will bring your own thoughts, your own ideas, questions, queries, all the rest of it. What I'm going to try and do is to cover something about her early life and the events that brought her to notoriety in the 70s, and then I'm going to talk about her book, Women, Race and Class, which is the title of this meeting, and which is a very important book, I think, at discussing some of the key issues that we face in our time. So Angela Davis shot to notoriety in August 1970 when she was placed on the FBI's most wanted list, and it was one of the defining moments, not just of her life, but I think that defined a moment in the struggle for black liberation, not just in America, but beyond. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. I just want to give a brief sketch of the events that led up to that. So Angela Davis was born in 1944 in the southern states of America, in Birmingham, Alabama, a city that Martin Luther King once described as the most segregated city in America. She was born in an area known as Dynamite Hill due to the number of black households that were firebombed by racists in that area. She attended a segregated school because education was still segregated when she was growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. But at 15, thanks to a Quaker scholarship, she was able to go north to an integrated school in Greenwich Village. And there's a brilliant bit in her autobiography where she describes getting onto a segregated train into the black carriage in the south and getting off a non-segregated train when the train arrived in New York. But obviously she didn't find a city that was free of racism, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. She went on to study at university in America, but also had the chance to travel around Europe, in France and in Germany. And in Germany in particular, she joined a socialist student group where she was involved in opposing the Vietnam War. And it's while she was studying in France that she learnt about the racist bombing on the 15th of September 1963 of the 16th Baptist Church in her hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls, school children, were killed in the attack by the racists, 2 of whom were personally known to Angela Davis and her family. She was very moved, as many people around the world were, by this event. She returned to America to study philosophy under the famous Marxist Herbert Marcuse. She was involved in lots of community struggles at this time, the growing movements against racism and police brutality. She also joined the Communist Party at the end of the 60s and was active in a group called the Chez Lumumba Club, which was a black collective within the Communist Party in LA at the time. In 1969, she got a job as an assistant professor of philosophy at UCLA in California. And she was increasingly, at this time, involved in struggles to defend political prisoners, including those who were members of the Black Panthers or who'd been jailed or killed by the racist state. And she was centrally involved in this campaign in the defence of the Soledad brothers, 3 black prisoners who'd been falsely charged with murdering a white guard. If we have time, we can talk more about this. It was a really seminal moment in the Black Power struggle. George Jackson was obviously brutally killed in prison some years later, and there's a lot more that we could talk about this. This is Angela Davis speaking out alongside someone who's a Black Panther at the time, speaking out at one of the many rallies and meetings that she went to in support of the Soledad brothers. And it's just worth putting this in the context of the 1960s, because the 1960s were an absolutely tumultuous time, not least for black people in America. The civil rights struggle in the southern states had forced desegregation, had won some civil rights, but had not ended racism, either north or south of the states. And the slogans of non-violence and looking to change being handed out from Washington were beginning to become overtaken by the slogans and the struggles of Black Power, symbolised most strongly in the Black Panthers. And there's a meeting tomorrow about the Black Panthers, so people may want to raise things in a discussion about it, but I'm not going to say any more about the Black Panthers just at the moment. Angela Davis had the misfortune to be working in a state where the governor was none other than Ronald Reagan, the future president of America. And here's Ronald Reagan. I put him in a picture with Margaret Thatcher because I can never think of him separately to Margaret Thatcher, because the two of them really had a project together and worked very closely on everything, and were both, you know, inveterate neoliberal racists as far as I'm concerned. So he was the governor of California, and he tried to have Angela Davis sacked not just once but twice. Firstly, for being a communist, and then secondly, when that failed, for increasingly speaking out over issues of injustice and oppression. And when Angela Davis was accused of being a communist, which was still very taboo in America in the 60s, you think about the McCarthyist witch hunts that had come before that, she gave this reply. She said, "Yes, I am a communist, and I will not take the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination because my political beliefs do not incriminate me. They incriminate the Nixons, the Agnews and the Reagans." In other words, it doesn't incriminate you to be a communist, it incriminates you to be a capitalist, and that they're the real criminals. And she was throwing the blame quite squarely back where it belonged. And I just want to pause and say something at this point about the Communist Party in America, because it can seem a strange choice, and not necessarily one that I would agree with as a Trotskyist, about why you would be in the Communist Party, a party that really accepts Stalinism and Stalinist regimes as representing socialism, not something that we agree with in the Socialist Workers' Party. But I think to understand it, you have to understand a little bit about the history of the Communist Party and the struggle against racism in America, because actually the Communist Party in America, going back to the 30s, had a proud history of being involved in the struggle against racism. In the 1930s, communist activists were the first people to take up the defence of the Scottsboro Boys, for example, a group of black teenagers who were wrongly accused of raping two white women in Alabama in 1931, a case that many other black radical groups, less radical groups, I should say, weren't initially willing to go near. Communist Party activists also bravely organised in the deep south of America, many of them losing their lives because of this. And across Europe, of course, Communist Party activists were central to many of the movements in resistance to fascism. And over the years, the Communist Party attracted many leading black thinkers and artists who were in or around the Communist Party. You probably know some of their names. Langston Hughes, the amazing poet, Paul Robeson, Lorraine Hansberry, Claudia Jones. And in Angela Davis's time herself, there were a number of impressive black activists who were in the Communist Party, who she mixed with, who she debated with, who she argued with, who were offering a strategy to fight racism that gave it a Marxist framework and linked it to the fight against capitalism. And I think it's this history that helps to explain the loyalty of key activists to the Communist Party, even after many people around the world saw the real nature of Stalinism during Russia's crushing of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, or the invasion of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring of 1968. And of course, the other side to this is that after McCarthyism, it was a brave stand to declare yourself a communist, a socialist, or a revolutionary, which is why Angela Davis was so defiant and so insistent on this point. And it wasn't just the Communist Party activists, actually. There was a rebirth of the left happening around this time, which pulled on a whole number of different ideas. And you can see this most strongly in the Black Panthers, who popularised the idea of socialism and being a revolutionary all over again in America. But people were really looking not to the traditional forms of what you would call socialist struggle, but by the 1960s we're looking away from Russia and looking to places like Miles, China, or looking to Cuba, somewhere that Angela Davis took a number of trips before and after she was in prison, or looking to liberation struggles in the global south. And Angela Davis maintained her membership of the Communist Party right up to 1991. She stood on a vice presidential ticket. These are a couple of the badges from the campaigns in 1980 and 1984. She left in 1991 when, with a group of people who were concerned about an attempted coup following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But let's get back to the story. And we're back to 1970, where Angela Davis wasn't just placed on the most wanted list by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, she was also described as armed and dangerous, which was essentially a green light, well, I suppose blue light for the cops, a blue light for any racist cop or vigilante to shoot her on sight. She had been accused of aggravated kidnapping and first-degree murder after an incident in a courtroom where a judge was among people who were shot dead in a failed attempt to free a group of political prisoners. And some of the guns that were used in that failed attempt to free the political prisoners were found to be registered in Angela Davis's name. These were very serious charges. They carried the potential of a death sentence. So this was very serious stuff we were talking about. Angela Davis went on the run with the help of a number of individuals, but she was arrested 2 months later, and a huge campaign broke out against her arrest. Exactly the same sort of campaign that she'd been involved in fighting for other people very strongly, and one of the strongest voices fighting for the freedom of those who were political prisoners at the time. And now a campaign was launched around the world in her defence. And these are just some of the badges and the posters. And you can see from that picture from the UCL students, it wasn't just black people. She had a huge black following, and huge numbers of black people from all over the States were part of her campaign, but also students, black and white together, all sorts of different people were involved in the campaign to free Angela Davis, and not just in the States. I used to work in an office in Birmingham where there was an older black guy who worked with me who talked, he'd never really been involved politically before or after, but he talked with great pride about being part of the campaign to free Angela Davis and of going out into the streets and selling badges and wearing the badges, and what that had really meant to him, and that sort of pride in standing up for one of his sisters who was in prison. Angela Davis's campaign was victorious. Through the mass movement, she was acquitted in 1972, actually by an all-white jury, which just shows that a mass movement can change the minds of everybody and can bring people to into the central spotlight. And since that time, she has continued the struggle. As I said, she is an absolutely key outspoken activist over prisons. She describes herself not just as a prison reformer, but as a prison abolitionist, and we can talk about that more if people want to. But she fights every form of oppression. She's been brilliant over the question of Palestinian rights, even at times when that's been a less popular thing to talk about. She was the honorary co-chair of the first Women's March against Trump, so she's still very much an activist and an educator and an academic. But I'm not going to have time to talk about all of those things that she's done since 1970, because that could take a few meetings in itself. Instead, what I really want to talk for the rest of the meeting about is about the title of this meeting, which is based on a book that Angela Davis wrote in 1981, Women, Race and Class. And it's a book that I think people should still read today. It is a book that speaks to many contemporary debates that we're having about racism, about feminism, about intersectionality, about strategies for liberation. And I'm going to come up to sum up some of these terms and discuss some of this at the end of the meeting. It's a remarkable book. The version that I've got, which is a version of the first one that was published, I don't know if it's changed in later versions, has no introduction and no conclusion. It just starts and then it just stops, which is kind of refreshing in a way, because sometimes you get a book and it's got a long preamble, blah, 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 blah. She just gets on with it and gets on with the argument, gets on with the history. It's rich. It's a book that I would advise people to read because it's rich in history, it's got stories, it's got quotation, and one of the things she does brilliantly, she brings out a hidden history of struggle, mostly involving black and white women at various points in history, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And to understand how the book works, for people who haven't read it, or even people who haven't read it for a long time, it's loosely divided into three parts. The first part is a discussion about the early women's movement and the struggle for black liberation. The last part is about the specific issues and concerns of black women in America in the second half of the 20th century. And there's a short middle section that I haven't really got time to talk about, which is a little collection of hidden histories of inspiring black and white women from a communist or a labour organising tradition in America. I haven't got time to discuss it, but I will just mention a couple of people. One of them that she talks about is Claudia Jones, who was a member of the Communist Party in America, who was an impressive Trinidadian-born communist who people probably know her actually because she was exiled from America and she came to Britain, where she was one of the instigators of the Notting Hill Carnival, and this is her marching on the streets in Britain. Or she talks about Ella Reeve Bloor, who was a white woman and a labour organiser who, at the age of in her 60s, was still hitchhiking across America, agitating among workers. And when she was arrested, she refused to leave jail every time she was arrested, unless her black comrades were also released from jail. But my favourite is a character called Lulia Jackson, who was a black woman leader of Pennsylvanian miners. And in 1934, Lulia Jackson attended a women's conference in Paris, where she heard a delegate arguing that women should all be pacifists and that they should treat warmongers like children, that basically they should indulge them and, you know, patronise them, but don't get too worried about it, and we should all be pacifists. And she replied like this. She said, "Ladies, it has been said that we must not fight, that we must be gentle and kind to our enemies and to those who are for war. I can't agree with that. Everyone knows the cause of war. It is capitalism. We can't just give those bad capitalists their supper and put them to bed the way that we do with our children. We must fight them." So she's got some brilliant history on all of these things, but I want to go back to the beginning of Women, Race and Class, where she talks about the birth of the women's movement and its relationship with questions of black liberation and slavery. You see, if you look at the history of the women's movement in America, the birth of the early women's movement was very closely related to the anti-slavery movement. In fact, the abolitionist movement involved lots of women, black and white, and for women to start to be taken seriously as political activists fighting for the abolition of slavery meant they also had to raise their voices and challenge people who questioned their right to be heard as political, outspoken women. So in the process of fighting as abolitionists, they also began to assert their right as women to be political activists, to be political voices, to be taken seriously in a political arena. And actually, Angela Davis points to moments where both organisationally and between individuals and between groups of people, unity existed between black and white women fighting for the same causes, for black liberation and for women's liberation. She gives, among many examples, the black and white women who faced arson, violent attack and jail, including numbers of white women for daring to educate black women and girls. And she writes of one of these white women, Myrtilla Minor. She writes, "Sisterhood between black and white women was indeed possible, and as long as it stood on a firm foundation, it could give birth to earth-shaking accomplishments." And it wasn't just sisterhood. She also talks about some of the prominent men, such as the former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who is described in the book, quite rightly in my view, as the foremost male proponent of women's rights in the 19th century America. She also talks about W.E.B. Du Bois, who was probably the foremost male proponent of women's rights in the early 20th century, another key black activist who could see the links between these different questions of oppression. And there was also briefly organisational unity between the struggles in the Equal Rights Association that was founded in 1866. But this unity did not last. And actually, many of the white leaders of the early white women's movement became either accepting or actually complicit or promoters of some of the racist arguments that parts of the movement have been fighting against. And we've got to ask ourselves why. And luckily, Angela Davis explains some of these things. Undoubtedly, some of it was to do with the personal prejudices that some of the activists carried, expressing the prejudices that exist at the time. But as we've seen, that's not inevitable, and it's not automatic. Some of it was because the different movements accepted that there had to be competition. Which was more important became a big argument. Was it more important to get black rights or to get women's rights? And some people accepted that there could be a competition between the two movements. Some of it was clearly opportunism. So the women's movement watered down some of its anti-racism in able to pander to and recruit more racist white women in the southern states. So for some people, it was just seen as an expedient way to expand their particular demands, even if it was at the cost of other liberation struggles. And for some people, shamefully, it was about tailing ruling class fears. So you can read quotes from the women who basically said, give women suffrage, give women the vote, because this is your best chance to protect the nation from the ignorant black voters. This was about a class fear that existed when the vote was extended to black people and to poorer people, that this would disrupt the rights of the ruling class and that this could be protected by giving ruling class women the vote in order to shore up the power of the ruling class. There were actually similar arguments made at different points about suffrage in the UK as well, but we haven't got time to talk about that. But also, part of the problem with all of this is it exposes the limitations of struggle within a capitalist framework. And Angela Davis points out that for all his brilliance, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist who was a proponent of women's rights and probably did quite one of the people who did the most to bring the movements together, had illusions in reform from the Republicans. The Republicans wanted to extend the vote to black men in the south of America in order to shore up their support in the south. They actually had no intention of granting economic freedom to black people anywhere or to actually ending racism, which is a lesson that Martin Luther King went on to learn in regard to the Democrats and the civil rights movement almost a century later. So part of this is about the limitations of looking for reforms within capitalism rather than fighting for genuine liberation that breaks through the boundaries of capitalism. The later parts of the book look at some of the specific concerns of black women. And it's one of the big strengths of the book that it talks about how class defines women's lives, including the specific ways that it affects black women. It has a materialist analysis that looks at the position of black women both before and after the Second World War, during slavery and after slavery, and the changes that that involves. And it looks at some of the concerns of the women's movement and specifically how these issues impact on black women. And this includes issues around reproductive rights, rape, housework, sexualised images of black women and black men. Implicit in some of this is a criticism that you still hear today sometimes about some of the strands of the women's movement that failed to include some of the specific concerns that black women were organising around. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think this is a good example, because Angela Davis talks a lot. You might not be able to read this at the back, but if you read Women, Race and Class, pretty much all of these facts are in Women, Race and Class anyway. Angela Davis talks about the struggle for reproductive rights, which she's quite rightly points out was a very important, the abortion rights struggle was a very important struggle for black women, poor women, Latino women, who the poorer you are, the more you're affected by bans on abortion rights, as we heard from the speakers from Ireland at the meeting yesterday. And we know currently there is a big battle over abortion rights with the victory in Ireland, but also with big threats to abortion rights now in America. Abortion rights are very important, but there's another aspect of reproductive rights that particularly impacts on black women in America, and that's the question of enforced sterilisation, which was a huge issue and actually remains an issue for people who've been affected by this. And there have been major battles against sterilisation programmes that have been used not just against black and Latino women, but also against people who are defined as mentally ill. This is some of the eugenics programmes that America has embarked on, but that particularly affected poorer women, black women, Native Americans, Latinos. And you'll see at the end of this slide, at the end of the 60s, over a third of women in Puerto Rico have been sterilised, either forcibly sterilised or basically to economic compulsion sterilised. You won't get any benefits, you won't get any work unless you accept this sterilisation programme. So the campaign over reproductive rights, to be relevant to a widest possible number of women, has to not just be about abortion rights, it also has to be over the question of the rights of people to have children as well, and against enforced sterilisation. She also talks about other things like the myth of the black rapist and how black men are particularly portrayed as a threat to white women in order to justify racist violence. And she goes all the way back to the Scottsboro Boys that I talked about earlier, but also looking at how this was used in lynching to justify the violent murder of black people through lynching and the people who fought back against that. But you see some of this today, I think. If you think about how Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism work today, if you think about how the media and the governments try to whip up scare stories, whether it's about Muslim grooming gangs or it's about migrants being a threat to women and all of those things, you see how the sexualisation of racism still exists very much and is still very much used today. And I want to move on really to talk about some of the conclusions that we can draw from some of this discussion that I've outlined in the book, and really to just try and open up a bit of a discussion about where this leaves us and where this leaves us today. The first thing really is just to say something about intersectionality, because Women, Race and Class, the book, is often credited with being one of the first texts to describe intersectionality, although of course the book doesn't use that term. It wasn't a term that was around at that time. I think it's important to note that, as Angela Davis does herself, that this wasn't the first book to look at the specific problems faced by black women. You can go back to Sojourner Truth in 1851 with her famous speech. I've only given a very short snippet of it there, that she gave to the Women's Convention in Ohio in 1851, demanding Ain't I a Woman, which was both a rebuttal against the sexist men who were attacking the women at that conference, but was also a comment also to the white women in the movement to say, remember me, I'm a black woman, I'm part of the women's movement as well. Or you could look at Claudia Jones's 1949 essay, An End to the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman, which is a brilliant essay specifically looking at the problems that black women faced in America at that time. But it is true that Women, Race and Class was one of several books that were written around this time that looked at the way that different oppressions worked, and in particular developed a critique of those feminists who based their politics on the demands and experiences of a small group of white middle-class women, or a large group of middle-class women in some cases. Now, intersectionality, of course, means many things to many people, and there is another meeting that will unpick this in a lot greater detail later in Marxism. For some people, it just means a recognition of the fact that people can have multiple oppressions, that you can be black, working class and a woman. For most people, it means something more than that. It says that actually the combined oppressions make something different. So you're not just black plus woman plus working class. Actually, it makes a kind of a new form of oppression in itself. But it is also about understanding how oppression works and how we can understand it better. What's a good example of this? An example of this, I suppose, is going back to the question of Islamophobia. Islamophobia doesn't just work as a form of racism. It works through a racism that, like all racisms, operates through gendered stereotypes. So, like I said, you have the Muslim man who's either seen as a sexual predator or is seen as a terrorist. Then you have the Muslim woman who's either in historical terms been presented as the exotic outsider or has been presented as the passive woman oppressed by wearing the veil. So you see how racisms operate through gendered stereotypes. It helps us to understand that. It also helps us to recognise that, for example, not all women can be represented by the concerns of a narrow group of middle-class women. In some ways, this is an analysis that's shared by Marxists. You know, we know that not all women are going to have the same interests or are going to have the same experiences. You think about the women in this room, we do not have the same interests or the same politics as Theresa May, who's making our lives an absolute misery, who's apparently locked in a secret meeting at the moment, which hopefully will be the downfall of Theresa May. But we don't share the same interests. And it's the same, actually, with not all black people will have the same interests. If you're rich and you're powerful, if you're Condoleezza Rice or you're a police chief, you are going to have a different set of political and material interests to your average black person on the street who is fighting against injustice. And actually, I said intersectionality means lots of things to different people. In Angela Davis's later writings, she is very clear that intersectionality should be about actual struggle and about looking outwards and linking up struggles for change and for justice, and not just about talking about identity or experience. This is one of the comments that she makes in Freedom is a Constant Struggle. For her, intersectionality is about the challenge of how do we link up many of the issues that we face around the globe. And I think that's quite a constructive way of thinking about it. However, I think one of the limitations with intersectionality is the way that it's become very closely linked to privilege theory, which I think is very unhelpful to struggles for liberation. And if people want to question that, obviously we'll talk about it in the discussion. But I think one of the strengths of Women, Race and Class is that it sees oppression within the context of class and of capitalism, not as something that is either inevitable or as something that is based on individual privilege. It gives it a material analysis and one that is based within that context of capitalism. So, for example, Angela Davis talks in her autobiography, one of my favourite books of all time, by the way. I would absolutely recommend that everybody start with her autobiography if you've never read Angela Davis, because it's absolutely gripping. But one of the many things she talks about is when she attended a black nationalist conference in London in 1967, where she was actually quite disappointed by the discussions and the debate that she heard there. And one of the things that she said coming out of that is when white people are indiscriminately viewed as the enemy, it is virtually impossible to develop a political solution. And this basically, to me, sums up the problem with privilege theory. Is if you're going to say that all white people are inherently racist, you're at a political dead end before you've even started, because how are you going to win liberation for black people if you're saying they're going to permanently come up against this inevitable struggle? And I think one of the challenges for us today is to understand where oppression comes from and who it benefits, how it is perpetuated by, and how it perpetuates capitalism. I'm glad people like this. I was going to put a demo on there, and then I saw this, and I thought, well, that's really nice. I'll put that on there. I suppose if I was going to have any criticism of the book Women, Race and Class, which I'm very reluctant to do because I love it, I think it's possibly that it doesn't actually fully develop the analysis of it doesn't fully develop the analysis of how oppression fits within capitalism, although it does point towards this many times in the book, and she points towards it also in her autobiography quite clearly, I would say. But I think one of the key questions that emerges from all the things that I've talked about and the themes that she raises around women, race and class is whether competition between oppressed groups is inevitable. And as Angela Davis shows, it's not. However, we do know that different oppressions can be played off against each other. We've seen this, for example, with the way that some feminists have been mobilised in the fight against Muslims. If you think about in France, actually, it's a very mainstream position for feminists to be against the rights of Muslim women to dress how they want to. So there can be that mobilisation. Actually here, there has been an attempt, which has been less successful, I would say, to mobilise LGBT activists against Muslims and to say that Muslims are more homophobic than other people. And actually, thanks to many left-wing activists, both Muslims and LGBT activists, there has been a real specific attempt to try and break down that attempt to divide the movement and play off that competition against each other. But you see, it comes down ultimately to a political question about how you understand oppression and how you see a strategy to end it. And in particular, it's about how oppression flows from the needs and the priorities of a capitalist system that is set up for profit. You see, for a long time, sections of the left spoke about questions of gender, race and class as the holy trinity of inequalities. They didn't just speak about them, they wrote numerous books about them. The first thing that you will notice from this is actually there are a huge number of oppressions and inequalities that are not represented in this holy trinity of gender, race and class. For example, Angela Davis is one of the most brilliant writers on the question of trans women and linking up her work on prisons with her critique of who gets to be included in the category of woman. She is absolutely brilliant on the rights of trans women to be taken seriously and to be included in the category of women. But there are many other forms of oppression and inequality that also have to be taken seriously, have to be challenged. And the point really, I think, is to say that class isn't just one of the several different oppressions that exist. It isn't just one of several different divides that shape our lives. Class is different to racism or to sexism or to homophobia or to transphobia or to prejudice against disabled people or prejudice against migrants or any of these things, because class is a source of power to fight back, that has the ability to unify struggle, but also to challenge the economic system which creates and perpetuates oppression. So you can have lots of different identities, and those identities can change over time, they can be in flux, you can prioritise different ones at different times, but you can still have a material interest in the overthrow of capitalism if you are part of the working class. And to say that class is more, the people who say to us that we're saying, that Marxists are caricatured as saying sometimes that class is more important than race or gender or any of these other oppressions, is to misunderstand what the argument is. Class struggle isn't more important than the struggle against racism or sexism. It also won't inevitably deal with those things. Those fights have to be had, and class struggle is not a substitute for those fights. But class struggle does have the potential to unite against divisions, and it also is the one source of economic power that can end the profit-driven system that creates oppression and that perpetuates oppression. And the conclusion that Angela Davis quite rightly drew throughout her life, and one that is an inspiration to the rest of us, is that really if we want to get rid of oppression, racism, sexism, all the rest of the crap that we have to live with, we have to fight for a different sort of society. And I think that's why Angela Davis is such an inspiration of her time and of our time, because like many of the rest of us, Angela Davis has always called herself a revolutionary, and that's the sort of solution that we need to see.